everybody. Welcome to New Detroit's Town Hall, Content and Conversations About Race. I'm your host, Marshalle Favors, Project Manager for New Detroit. New Detroit is a nonprofit organization that works to eliminate racism and create a more just society in metropolitan Detroit. To learn more about our mission and our organization, please visit online, newdetroit.org. Well, today's discussion, we are taking a look at the origins of race as a social construct and the historical impact of systemic racism. We have a all-star, that I believe, team of historians that are going to share some thoughts and ideas with you today. And the format for today's discussion is part presentation and part dialogue. And our guest speakers include Robert Smith, President of History Remake. He's a producer of historical media and exhibition specialist. He has extensive experience and a long history in developing public history programs and resources in African American history. Jamon Jordan is an educator, writer, and historian of African American and African history for over 20 years. He's a researcher of Black history for decades, and he runs the Black Scroll Network History and Tours, where he leads tours and presentations dealing with African American history in the Detroit area, throughout Michigan and the United States. Ken Coleman reports for MichiganAdvance.com, and on Southeast Michigan, he reports on education, civil rights, and voting rights. His work has been cited in the Detroit News, Detroit Free Press, History Channel, and CNN. Welcome, all of you. Thank you for joining us.
Welcome.
I'm so glad to have you. And I'm going to kick things off with Robert Smith. I call him Bob also. He has done a lot of work for New Detroit, most recently with our genealogy storytelling racial healing project, where we explored like the origins of race. I know that in our work at New Detroit, we're constantly saying that race is a social construct. People have heard that term, they hear that concept, but what does that really mean? So we explored, where did the entire idea of race come from, and how was it institutionalized in our country? And so Bob is going to share some content with you on the origins of race, and I'm going to turn it over to you now.
Okay. Can we see that?
I can see it.
Okay, great. Okay. Again, my name is Bob Smith, and I'm certainly glad to be here today with these other great historians. Looking forward to their presentations. And I'm the kickoff man, so my purpose is to take a look at race from the broad global understanding of how it began to evolve 400 years ago. And so that's what we're going to look at to start. A lot of us, when we think about race, we really think about the more recent race. And we think about the history of African Americans, we sort of think about it starting in 1619. But actually, the concept of race being associated with Black people starts almost 200 years earlier. And let's take a look at this map, and we can kind of get an idea of what was going on, say at around the 1400s, actually going all the way back to 700, when Arabs began to go down into Central Africa and to remove large numbers of Africans from the area that's now the Congo to work on sugar plantations in the Mediterranean. And so this is the first large-scale sort of extraction of Africans from Africa. But the basic concept of slavery being associated with Black people did not necessarily emerge at this time, but it's the beginning. It's a significant historical development that occurs at this point. Also on this map, you see over in West Africa, salt, gold, and slaves. And so there was large salt deposits, there was gold there. And so that becomes a primary objective later on of the Portuguese. One of the things that happens in the early 1400s is that there is a race to find a route to China. that China is a major trading partner in the world, and they have gold, silk, and the Europeans are much interested in trying to establish a direct route to trade with China, as opposed to going through the Arabs or going through the Venetian traders. And so what they're trying to do is to develop shipping routes, lanes directly to China. The problem is that the technology of sailing does not allow them to do that. But the Portuguese, borrowing sailing technologies from the Muslims, develop a ship called the Caraval that can travel against the wind. This is a major development. It's almost like the rocket booster going to the moon in terms of technology of travel. It allows the Portuguese to begin to travel down the coast of Africa. So their objective is to travel around Africa to get to China. And so in the process of doing that, they began to send out explorers down the coast of Africa. And as they traveled down the coast of Africa, they began to interact with the Africans, also with Arab traders. And they discover that the Arabs have a very lucrative trade in salt, gold, and slaves. And so initially they're purchasing salt, gold, and slaves directly from the Arabs. And they began to develop relationships with the African tribal chiefs along the coast to trade directly with the Africans. And to basically, over a period of about 100 years, they eventually take control of that trade from the Arabs, and they began to build a series of forts along the coast of Africa of slaves. And one of the things that they do is that they take control of some of the islands off the coast of Africa, one island being Saint Thomé. And they also began to develop sugar plantations on those islands. And so Portuguese basically took over the sugar production from the Mediterranean, and it's very productive and very lucrative. They actually become the larger producer of sugar around 1470. And so this is sort of the beginning, that they're shipping large numbers of Africans directly from the Congo into these islands. So it's really the beginning of developing this infrastructure. They've built forts along the coast of Africa. Now they're developing industrialized slavery on these islands. And so the process, the infrastructure for what would be eventually become part of the North American experience is being developed along the coast of Africa by the Portuguese. And this is one of the first castles that they built, the Alameda Castle on the west coast of Africa in 1482. And this is 10 years before Columbus even sails across the sea to supposedly discover America. And so in one sense, the die is almost cast. The system of enslavement of large numbers of Africans exists even before the colonization of America. And one of the questions that come up, and I think that we should at least address this question, at least talk about it a little bit, is why would the Africans participate in the slave trade? Now, the issue is that at this particular point in time in history, Europeans did not have the capacity, the ability to go into the interior of Africa. They did not have the military ability to do that. So in order to develop the slave trade, they had to have the participation of the Africans in that process. Part of what happens is that Africans did not have the sort of nation states that existed in Europe. And so you had these various nations that existed in Africa along ethnic lines. And as the Portuguese began to trade, they began to trade in guns. And so these warring ethnic groups, really, guns become sort of a priority. And so the more guns that they trade with, the more conflict, the more slaves. And so that whole process of the disruption of African life begins with the Portuguese and begins with the slave trade. The other thing that happens during this period, even before Columbus comes to America, is a book is published by a guy named Gomez Inez de Zara in 1452. And he's basically describing in very negative terms Africans in terms of how they look, how they dressed, and so forth. This book is published and distributed all over Europe. And so most Europeans have no concept or understanding of Africa. And so this is their first look at what Africans could be. And so we began to see sort of this intellectual development of these ideas about Africa and about the views on African inferiority, even before, again, Columbus comes to America. But Columbus does come to America. And when he comes with an attitude of subduing the Indian tribes. When we talk about racism, most of the discussion many times is about Black and white racism. But we should also include in that discussion about the Native Americans as well, because Columbus sort of sets the pattern of behavior that would occur in America with Native Americans and eventually with Africans as well. Within about 30 years, where Columbus lands in the Bahamas, where the Lacayan Indian natives are, and within 30 years, the entire population of about 30 to 40,000 Native people in the Bahamas are completely wiped out by they're enslaved, they're forced to dive for pearls, they're forced to look for gold, but they're completely eradicated. So within 30 years, an entire group of people are eradicated by Columbus and the conquistadors that come with him. The other thing that happens during this period of Spanish incursion, because the Spanish eventually take over the slave trade from the Portuguese, and they become the major player in the Atlantic slave trade. And they take over those forts along the coast of Africa. And so they began to bring large numbers of slaves into South America. The Portuguese bring large numbers of slaves into Brazil. And so here again, the whole process of enslavement and being equated with Blacks is occurring even before the North American continent is settled. But this is probably one of the most important historical events in history, and that's the defeat by the English of the Spanish Armada, because Spain basically controlled the slave trade. They controlled the Atlantic Ocean. They had the largest navy, but through a fluke of history, they're defeated by the British in 1588. And so the British began to take over the Atlantic trade along with the slave trade. And so in 1619, also, so in 1606, I should say, in 1620, the British established colonies in North America. And so this is the next phase of European colonization of North America when the English become involved. And so over a period, when the English, well, just like with Columbus, when the English come into contact with the natives, initially, they're pretty coy with them and they try to make peace with them. What happens, and there's a reason for that. The reason is that before the 1606 settlement in Jamestown, there was an English ship that came to America in which the entire group of colonizers disappeared. It was about 200 of them. And so the theory is that they got wiped out by the Native Americans. The English needed the Native Americans to survive the first few years. But once they survived and were able to get food and to store up enough food, they turned on the Native Americans. And like Columbus, they began to war against them and wiped many of them out in New England along the eastern seaboard. The next thing that happens is that they had the same objective. That was to find a short route to China, or either to discover gold. When they did not find the short route to China and they didn't discover gold, then their objective was to develop plantation economy, which they began to do. Initially, they relied upon indentured servants for a period of time. And that was a very short period of time. But they found out that the indentured servants did not provide them all of their labor needs. And so they began to import large numbers of Africans. We hear about the 1619 Africans coming, but the die was already cast. 1619 is just sort of a blimp. Eventually, large numbers of slaves were going to be brought into North America, either by the Spanish or by the English. And they began to come in large numbers. So by 1640, the English realizes that they cannot depend upon white indentured servants to supply their labor needs. And so they needed a guaranteed supply of labor. So they developed a series of laws that will guarantee that Africans can be permanently enslaved. And so here are some examples of some of those laws that were developed during this period. For example, blacks are excluded from possessing firearms, black women are taxed, blackface, and this is the critical one in 1662, that black face a life of servitude so that any child born to an enslaved woman will also become a slave. And there's a series of other laws. Even if a person is baptized, and that does not exempt them from slavery if they're black. And so we see the use of the legal system working with the economic system to ensure a permanent supply of slavery. Now, the key part of sort of the racism and sort of the white superiority piece is that we see this sort of social hierarchy that exists in colonial America in the early period. We have the planter class, which is the elite that own most of the best land. We have the small white farmers. We have former indentured servants. We have indentured servants, and we have slaves. And so the actual elite is a fairly small part of the population. The thing that drives racism is the fact that these white indentured servants and former indentured servants and small black farmers, they believe that eventually that they can be at the top of the pyramid. And so they're not slaves. And so slaves play a very important part in solidifying whiteness and making them understand that yes, they may be poor whites, but they always have the opportunity to become wealthy in this country because they can never become slaves. And so you get this sort of idea that you can be white, you can be poor, but you're still superior. The English actually, at this point in 1616, they now control the slave trade, and they began to ship large numbers of Africans to the United States. Here again, and the way they control the slave trade is they took over control of all of these forts. And if you control the forts, you control the shipping lanes, you control the trade. And so let's take a look briefly at this map of the slave trade. Many people may say that this map does not really accurately reflect the large numbers of Africans who were actually brought. But even if we use this map, we can see that a total of something like 11 million people were shipped during the Atlantic slave trade. And the interesting thing about this chart is that the ones who were shipped to the United States is actually a relatively small number of people. It's only 2.7% out of the huge numbers that was shipped to the Americas. And one of the reasons for that is because the ones who were shipped to Brazil and to the Caribbean were literally worked to death. They basically continued to ship slaves just to supply the labor needs of those colonies. But in America, it's a little different, that you have a natural attrition of slaves that began to occur. And this map shows the colony of where the Africans were, but it also shows the significant number of African-American population. So in 1700, there's 11% of the population in the colonies is Black. By 1775, 20% is Black. That's extremely significant. Also, this chart shows that by 1780, there were almost 500,000 African-Americans in the United States. The key thing about this chart is that this 500,000 represents the ancestors of most African-Americans who are here today. So this is where our ancestry goes to. Not many more Africans will be brought to this country after this period of time. This is not true for white people. Most white people's ancestries can be traced to the large numbers of European immigrants, the Irish and the Germans that started coming to America in 1830. And so in places like Detroit. Now, this is another chart that shows why slavery and race become so intertwined. During the colonial period, America was the second richest part of the world at that time. In other words, if we measure wealth by foreign trade per capita, the 13 colonies were just behind Britain in terms of wealth. And that's because of the exports that they were shipping out, particularly in terms of cotton production, tobacco production, and rice and indigo at that time. This wealth would grow. And we can see from 1700 to the Revolutionary War, the amount of the trajectory of that wealth. We can also see that 10% of the population owned most of the wealth in this country at that time, primarily driven by slave trade. This is another important chart. In 1735, European scientists and intellectuals began to develop these theories of racial classification. At this time, the world has never known, people were not divided up by any sort of classification. And so race and enslavement now exist. And so now they're trying to justify it. Now they're trying to come up with a theory for why you can enslave Africans. And part of that is also this emergence of the concept of whiteness. This is relatively new. This occurs during the colonial period. Before then, people did not call themselves white. Black people did not call themselves black. And so you have this description from Jefferson where he's using the term white and he's using the term black. And so this is relatively new. And this is another point I want to make about before we end this, my part of the presentation. Now, one of the things that happens in this country when we talk about the Constitution and we talk about the fact that all men are created equal, and we have this sort of issue of race and unequalness in this country. Well, what many people don't understand about the Constitution and about the Declaration of Independence is that Jefferson did not necessarily write this. He borrowed most of these ideas. Most of what's in this Constitution comes from John Locke, the philosopher. Okay, that's where Jefferson gets all of these, many of these ideas that he's writing about in the Constitution. Now, one of the things that Locke says in his theories, his political theories, is that if you're captured in war, then you're not a man. You cannot be classified as a human being. You're property. Okay, that's an important concept. The other thing he says in his writings is that if you have land and you're not using it and it's not being cultivated, then you have no right to that land. Someone else who's going to cultivate it can come along and take it. This is directed at the Native Americans. The concept of property is directed at people of African descent who are now enslaved, because the idea is that they were captured in war in Africa and brought here as property. And so this is what the white men, they knew this when they wrote the Constitution, that African Americans and people who were enslaved were never meant to be part of this sort of human race that exists. And so it's the law, it's the Constitution that sort of enshrines slavery. And lastly, slavery would have probably died a natural death had it not been for technology and the cotton gin. Europeans in Virginia were destroying the soil. The tobacco was depleting the soil because they were not rotating the crop. And if you got a large number of slaves and you have no crop to plant, you're in trouble financially. What saved this country and made slavery grow is that the American Revolution, after the victory, it gave access to all of this rich bottomland along the Mississippi River, down in Alabama and Georgia. And so those wealthy planters in Virginia could now buy up land in this rich bottomland along the Mississippi River, where the soil will never be depleted, no matter how much you plant. The next thing that happens is the invention of the cotton gin. These things happen almost at the same time, where now you can process cotton rapidly, 10 times faster than before. So the combination of this rich bottomland and the cotton gin explodes and makes this country, and you have industrial slavery, and it makes this country one of the richest countries in the world at that time. 800,000 people, some of our relatives, are marched down into the Deep South. I mean, literally marched over a period of 5 or 6 years from the East Coast in down South, where these plantations are being established. It's this group of people And we can here again, we can look at the exports. In 1800, it's 7.1% of the United States export. In 1820, cotton is 32%. In 1840, it's almost half, 51%. In 1860, by the Civil War, it's 57% of this country's wealth in terms of production. Not just in the South, because it's ships in New England that's shipping this cotton over to England, where the Industrial Revolution is emerging. Many historians believe that the Industrial Revolution, the wealth of the world, both Europe and America, is built on the backs of Black slavery in this country. It fuels the economic growth and the explosion of production machinery. And so many of these people who are in the South producing after the Civil War, and by beginning around 1910, 1915, will begin migrating to Detroit. And that's my part of the presentation. I'm going to take this off of share.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that deep, rich history. It was definitely a part of history that I did not get. And I would say in my grade school or high school, a part of my education, at least a lot of the details that you went into. So thank you for that. And it's given us a great foundation to lead us into our next part of the discussion. And Jamon Jordan is going to talk about our historical roots in Detroit. And what I love about your work, Jamon, is that if anyone takes your tour or if anyone listens to any of your commentary online, you bring up history. Again, I want to call it almost like missing history. It's details and facts that people may not be aware of broadly. So can you bring us in and talk about our historical roots to Detroit and how it relates to race and race relations in our area?
Yes, thank you. And I really want to thank Bob for really opening the door for how I'm going to proceed. So I really want to thank him for laying the red carpet out for me so I can start. So he, of course, talked about this history of how we get to the transatlantic slave trade, how that kind of got organized by European countries, and how the 13 colonies, which will become the United States, how they kind of form with this racial hierarchy in place, and it's even enshrined in the Declaration of Independence and then in the Constitution. So the 13 colonies, of course, were British colonies, and of course, Detroit doesn't start out as a British colony. It starts out, of course, as indigenous land, but then the French will be the first Europeans to claim the area that we now live in, which is called Detroit. So what's happening on the East Coast of the United States in the 13 colonies is what Britain is doing. And then what's happening in Detroit or in Michigan and in parts of what was known as Upper Canada at that time is what the French are doing. And there's some things that are similar, but there's some other things that we ought to know. And so at the 13 colonies, by the time we get to the 1700s, of course, slavery is entrenched. And in South Carolina, African-American, Black people outnumber the white people in South Carolina. And there's a rebellion called the Stonewall Rebellion in 1739. After that Stonewall Rebellion in 1739, the South Carolina, at that time, colony government comes up with strict ways of dealing with Black people, particularly enslaved Black people, but even free Black people. One of those things, of course, is they can't be educated. So that becomes a part of it. And so that's going to trickle throughout the rest of the colonies in some way or some form or fashion, the inability of Black people to be educated or the separate education of Black people. What's happening in Michigan or in Detroit, which is a French area, a French controlled area in the 1730s, is something similar, but we don't talk about it that much. Now in 1685, Louis XIV, the King of France, passes the Le Code or signs the Le Code Noir, which is the Black codes. And basically he says that the French have the right to bring enslaved people into the French Canada, and of course, including the area that we know as Detroit. So when Antoine de la Mothe Cadillac arrives in 1701 to set up a fur trade with the Native Americans, the French are knee deep in the slave trade. And that's been sanctioned by the King of France decades earlier. And so the wealthy French who come to the city of Detroit will be slave owners in the city of Detroit. That's a history that we don't talk about as much, but it's beginning to be talked about a little bit more. That Detroit had slavery, not originally under the Americans, not originally under the British. Michigan wasn't, and Detroit wasn't part of the 13 colonies, but under the French. So the French will enslave both Native Americans, but Africans too. And so so those wealthy Frenchmen, we know their names, the Campbell family, the St. Aubin family, we say St. Aubin today, the Beaubiens, the Rivards, the Desquinders, the Livoinoirs, these wealthy families, these wealthy French families in the city of Detroit, most of them are slave owners in the city of Detroit. And so they're practicing slavery of both the Native Americans, the indigenous people, and Africans. So they're enslaving African people. And the earliest record we have of a Black person living in Detroit is an unknown negress who's buried on the original grounds of Saint Anne's du Detroit, which was inside of Fort Pontchartrain du Detroit, which was established by Antoine de la Mothe Cadillac. So roughly that's in the Hart Plaza area of the city of Detroit. In fact, the original St. Anne's sat where the Scientology church is today. So that's where this unknown negress was buried, who was owned by Louis Campbell. The reason she's unknown is because the French stated that they do not list the names of the enslaved people in their burial records in the 1700s. So we know she's an enslaved Black woman too. So she's enslaved, we don't know her name. She's buried on the grounds of the original St. Anne's du Detroit inside of Fort Pontchartrain. So this is happening. So we're getting race, and it's attached to slavery. So race in Detroit originates as an attachment to the practice of slavery among the wealthy French in the city of Detroit. So those two things are connected, just as they were connected in the long history, hundreds of years before that Bob just outlined. And so now when we get to the period of the French, and then later the British will take over the city of Detroit, the British will practice slavery in the city of Detroit as well. Just as they're practicing it in the 13 colonies, they're going to practice it in the city of Detroit. And so we'll have British slave owners like John Randolph. We'll have British slave owners like even Elijah Brush at one time. And we'll have the largest slave owner in Michigan's history who would be British, and that's the Macomb family leading William Macomb. He's the leading person in that family and the largest slave owner in Michigan's history. And so the British are also slave owners in the city of Detroit. And again, race, this idea of race, Black people, white people, and Native American people in Detroit is tied to slavery. And of course, it's also tied to taking the land of the indigenous people. So all of that is tied up in this history of race in Detroit. And so we're going to get a lawsuit in 1807 because no one accepts slavery. Just as the indigenous people, the Native Americans, didn't accept their land being taken. They fought wars. They won some and lost many. And we know a major one that would encompass Detroit would be Pontiac's rebellion in 1763. He's going to lead a rebellion. Part of that is over resisting the taking of land by the British, the taking of Native American land. Well, Africans also resisted enslavement and oppression, and they resisted in many ways. They broke the tools, they ran away, they burned the crops, they refused to work, they escaped, they poisoned their enslavers. But one thing they also did is they sued. So there are hundreds of lawsuits of people who are suing for their freedom throughout the country. But I'm going to talk about Detroit, but throughout the country, there's hundreds of lawsuits of people who are enslaved and taking their cases to court to be free. And in Detroit in 1807, Peter and Hannah Dennison sued for the freedom of their 4 children. So they were enslaved by the Macombs. The Macombs sold them to the Tuckers. And this is now, Detroit is now American soil. It's 1807. So we're not in the French period, we're not in the British period, but you still have slavery in the city of Detroit because the former British and former French are allowed to continue practicing slavery. And so Peter and Hannah Dennison, whose children have been they were sold to the Tuckers too, but they eventually became free. But their children have been passed down from Catherine and William Tucker to Catherine and William Tucker's children in the will. They sue. They take their case to court. The territorial Supreme Court justice is Augustus Woodward. So Augustus Woodward is going to rule that if your children were born after 1796, they are free. There's no slavery. There can be no person born after 1796 into slavery in Detroit. But if they were born prior to that, they were born in the British period or in the French period, they're enslaved for life, which applies to the 4 children of the Dennises. Well, one of them was allowed to be free when he turned 25, but the other 3 were enslaved, were going to be enslaved for life. 2 of them, the 2 oldest, will escape and go to Canada and eventually return years later. But this is now, we're enshrining slavery, race in the justice system that is emerging in the city of Detroit. The Chief Justice, Augustus Woodward, who was sent here by Thomas Jefferson, who we've already talked about, has now made race and slavery a part of Michigan jurisprudence. So now we're talking about race and slavery and Black folks in the city of Detroit in the judicial system. It is now being a part of that. And so in 1819, Michigan's territorial charter states that to be an elector, to be a voter, you can't be Negro. You have to be a white. You have to be white. I mean, they don't mention Native Americans, but they say you have to be white, and you can't be Negro, and you can't be mulatto. So now in 1819, Michigan is still a territory, but they have territorial representatives. To be a voter, they're enshrining race. So now we have race enshrined in the political system. We have it enshrined in the jurisprudence system in the city of Detroit. And it's intimately connected to slavery. Because in 1819, there's some Black people are still enslaved in the city of Detroit. And so we get to 1822, and Virginia is going to pass a mulatto law. What is a mulatto? So they're going to pass, so we know about the 1-drop rule, but in the legal system, they needed to break that all the way down. What does it take for you to be a mulatto? And they define a mulatto as being 1/16 or less, or more, 1/16 or more Black. So if you got 1/16 Negro blood or more, you could be classified as a mulatto, up to 1/2. 1/16 up to 1/2, you can be classified as a mulatto. And mulattoes can't vote. That's what the law was about, Virginia. And mulattoes aren't citizens in Virginia in 1822. Right after that, in 1827, Michigan and Ohio will pass an ordinance that says all Negroes and mulattoes who come to Michigan and Ohio must pay a $500 bond to the county clerk to live in Michigan. So if you're a resident of Michigan, you're Black and you're a resident of Michigan, then you're grandfathered in. But if you come here from somewhere else and you're a Negro or a mulatto, after Virginia has passed this kind of what is a mulatto, if you come to the city of Detroit or you come to Michigan, you have to pay a $500 fee to the county clerk. That's roughly $13,000 in today's dollars. So what it's trying to do is prevent Michigan from being a haven for Black people, particularly people escaping from slavery, but also really try to set up Michigan as a white site, a white region. And Ohio is doing the same thing. And so in that context, you get 2 former slave owners in the city of Detroit who will found what is now the longest still existing business in the city of Detroit. And that's the Detroit Free Press. Detroit Free Press was founded by Joseph Campbell and his nephew, John R. Williams, who were both slave owners in the city of Detroit. And for the first 100 years of the Detroit Free Press's existence, it was a white supremacist newspaper, no holds barred. For the first 30 years, it's not only white supremacist, it's pro-slavery. So it's a pro-slavery organ because 2 slave owners founded it, Joseph Campbell and John R. Williams, his nephew. And so you have these 2 slave owners founding it during the Civil War. It's almost sympathizing with the South. It's going to promote what is going to be the race riot in 1863 is going to be writing all kind of anti-Black, anti-Lincoln, anti-emancipation kinds of articles, which helped to create the level of fear and the level of tension, which will result in an uprising or a race riot in 1863, in March of 1863, before the New York draft riots, which occurred a few months. In fact, during this would be the first day of the New York City draft riots in 1863, in July of 1863. But months before that, Detroit had a race riot. And the free press was a large part of it. The free press is, of course, intimately tied to slavery because 2 slave owners are found in it. It is created in the climate of trying to keep Black people out of Michigan after the act was passed to keep Negroes and mulattoes out of the state of Michigan unless they pay a $500 fee. All of that is connected. And in 1843, so there are Black people, prominent Black people here in the city of Detroit who don't care about any of these anti-racist laws. They're fighting against that. They're fighting first for freedom. They're abolitionists. They're leaders of the Underground Railroad. Many of them own their own businesses. They have institutions that they founded or co-founded. And so they're fighting for full rights. They're not even fighting just to end slavery. They're fighting for full citizenship for Black people or Negroes or colored, whichever those terms people were using at the time. And so there's a colored convention in 1843, which takes place at Second Baptist Church, the oldest Black church in the state of Michigan. And of course, many abolitionists are a part of the Second Baptist because it's kind of founded by abolitionists, leaders of the Underground Railroad. And this colored convention, one of the speakers is William Lambert. And William Lambert gives a speech where he's not even talking about just the end to slavery, although that's the cornerstone of the speech. He's talking about voting rights for Black people in the 1840s. He's talking about full education for Black people in the 1840s and full citizenship for Black people in the 1840s at this colored convention. The Michigan Supreme Court is going to respond the next year. It won't be long. It doesn't take them long. There's going to be a case called Gordon versus Ferrara in 1844. And the Michigan Supreme Court rules that Gordon can vote because he's Black, but he can vote because he looks white. And so they basically use, if you look white, we're going to call you white. But a lot of people aren't happy about this, because they know he has some Negro ancestors. It's far back, but they know he has some Black folks in his family. So in 1847, another lawsuit, People versus Dean. And Dean, this case goes to the Michigan Supreme Court, and they outline what it is to be white. So they give a legal definition for the state of Michigan and what is white. And what is white is less than 1/16 Negro. That will be the definition of white in the state of Michigan due to the Michigan Supreme Court case 1847. So if you're less than 1/16 Black or Negro, then you're white, excluding any Native American, if you don't have any other racial ancestry. But if it's just Negro and white, if you're less than 1/16 Negro, then in Michigan, that was considered white. Dean was that, so he was allowed to vote. So People versus Dean, this white man who was he was Black, but he was less than 1/16 Negro, he was allowed to vote. And so now it's enshrined in the Michigan Supreme Court. What race is, or at least what Black and Negro is, or what Negro and white is. And then we get to 1850, and Indiana does something similar to what Michigan and Ohio had did, except they don't give you the ability to pay $500 fee. They just say no Negroes can move or live in Indiana. So they bar Black people in their constitution. In the Indiana Constitution of 1850, they bar Negroes and mulattoes from being residents. Now, the ones who are already there, they're grandfathered in, but not no new ones, no new people, no new Negroes moving to Indiana. So if you're already here, that's fine, but no, we don't want any new Negroes moving here. And so now they're bringing, of course, race in the context of inferiority, or we don't want you here. And so we get, of course, the major cases, the Dred Scott versus Sanford case in 1857. And we know that in that case, the Supreme Court will rule that Dred Scott doesn't even have the right to sue because he's not a citizen. Negroes aren't citizens, so they don't even have the right to take any cases to court. They have no rights that whites are bound to respect. And so Sanford, who is suing for him and his family's freedom, will lose the case because the Supreme Court is really ruling you're Black, therefore not a citizen. And this is going to reverberate in Detroit in 1869 when the Workmen versus Board of Education cases comes. So when Joseph Workman sues for his child to be able to go to the public schools, Detroit public schools are segregated. Black people go to these inferior colored schools that don't have as much time of the day. They don't have as many grades. They don't have as many teachers. They don't have any of the resources that the white public schools have. And so Joseph Workman sues. The Detroit Board of Education fights him. The attorney who's fighting to stop Black people from going to school is Henry Duffield. So Henry Duffield is the attorney for Detroit Public Schools. It used to be a school in Detroit named after him. The building is still there. It's called Ralph Bunche today. He sued, he's fighting the case to keep Black people from going to these schools. So you got this long history. Eventually that case is won and Black people are allowed to go to public schools, but because of housing segregation, the schools will still be unequal because you're zoned to go to school where you live. And racial restrictive covenants, which is what private owners do, the FHA, the National Housing Act of 1934, 1937, and 1949, the federal government, it gets into the racial discrimination in housing, and real estate agents, banks, they all are segregating Black people. And so because of that, the schools will remain unequal because where you live determines what school you go to. Even in the city of Detroit, the schools are unequal, but then when whites leave, of course, the schools remain unequal. We already talked about Workmen versus Board of Education, but Milliken versus Bradley is really fighting that same fight over again. And Gary B versus Whitmer, which just was settled, that's still that same fight. Unequal education based on race. And so we have this long history of how race has played a part in the city of Detroit, and it's tied to slavery first, Jim Crow, segregation later, and the federal government, the city government, the judicial system, and the political system, all defining race and defining Black people as inferior, less than, or ought to be enslaved. All right.
You've really given us a lot. The both of you have, at this point, and we're just scratching the surface. I mean, this deep, rich history, we really need to spend more time with it and to really understand where we come from, where we are today. I'm going to have Ken jump in on this conversation to keep us going, and we're going to continue to kind of bring it up to like the modern day. Your charge is to bring some of this historical past to the modern day, to talk about systemic racism as it exists in this country, and alongside some of the themes that have been brought up, because I know that you also write about education, you write about civil rights, you write about voting rights, and Jamon has laid out some historical context about that. So I'm going to pass the ball to you to keep the conversation going.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you, New Detroit, for the opportunity. There's no doubt modern day systemic racism has its origins in the history of this country and the history of the world. There's no doubt about that. Bob and Jamon have aptly provided a lead-in for where I'll pick up. Bob with the transatlantic slave trade, Jamon bringing it back home, bringing it home to how it related to Detroit and the land on which we live today. Those nefarious actions by the British and the French were codified, as the gentleman pointed out before me, codified in public policy and embedded through policies like Jim Crow throughout in the South and even up here in the North. So amid where we live in 2020, as I try to bring it home a little bit, the recent escalating challenges and clashes between protesters and police, not only here in Detroit, but across the country and the world. We're seeing the vestiges of that systemic racism, which still exists. There's no doubt about it. Detroit has had a front row seat at the table when it comes to systemic racism and how it has been challenged and how it still exists in 2020. A little bit of Detroit history of the 20th century. The gentleman before have led me up to this, but you can't talk about what's going on in 2020 without talking about what happened in 1925. Dr. Ossian Sweet, an African-American physician, has to buy a house at 3 times the value that any white person would have bought it. That's systemic racism and vestiges of the transatlantic slave trade and how it was carried out in this region of the world. He has to buy it at 3 times the value because he is a black man who chooses to live in an all-white community. This is in 1925. Let's fast forward to 1948. 15-year-old Leon Mosley, a kid from Black Bottom on the Lower East Side, the community that I live in today, is sought after by police for allegedly stealing a car. After young Mosley is apprehended, he's able to break free from 2 white cops. Running away from white cops, not running to them, no threat to them. Mosley is shot, fatally shot in the back. And as the story gets told over and over and over again in Detroit in the 1920s, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, the white police beat the charge against an African-American, and in this case, a 15-year-old African-American boy. The following year, the city of Detroit decides, city of Detroit government decides, and that government is led by white folk. 9 white men and 1 white woman. The 9 members of the Detroit, at that time called Common Council, and the mayor at that time, who was elected in 1949, Albert Cobo, they decide that they are going to take a section of the city, which is largely African American, which is largely poor, and transform that community into what they hope will be a middle class white community. Black Bottom is transformed into what we know today as Lafayette Park, and to some extent Elmwood Park. Communities located just outside of downtown Detroit to the east. And of course, we all know, and part of what brought New Detroit into being, the 1967 rebellion happens beginning on July 23rd, 1967. It is largely African Americans pushing back against police brutality that's been carried out by white cops. It's hard to imagine today because Detroit is a super black community, African American community. 80% of its population is black. But at one time, in January of 1967, for example, only 200 of the 4,000 member Detroit police force was black. Only 200 of the 4,000 member Detroit Police Department was black. The rest was white. But at that time, 40% of the black folks, 40% of the people that lived in Detroit were black folks. It was becoming a chocolate city, like the phrase that came out, that sort of became popular in the 70s. Detroit was becoming a chocolate city. Cities like Atlanta and Washington, D.C. followed. But we have continually been, Detroit that is, the largest city with a majority or supermajority black population. That's important when we talk about systemic racism and how it has continued to be carried out in America today, and in cities, and sometimes even in Detroit. That systemic racism still has resonance. Imagine this, consider this. The first Black family moves into the Northwest enclave in Detroit called Rosedale Park. The first Black family does not move into that community until the 1970s. And as Jamon pointed out, Black folks have lived on this land since the 1700s. The great scholar, Norman McCrae, pointed out in his PhD dissertation that African people have been on this land since at least 1736. But the first Black family moves into the Northwest Detroit enclave, Rosedale Park, in the 1970s. So what am I saying here? The policy challenges that we have today, the systemic racism that we have today, has been alleviated in some ways. We elected the first African-American mayor, Coleman Young, in 1973. He gave us the first Black police chief in 1976. For many years in the 1970s and 1980s, both the Common Council or City Council, the city's legislative branch, has been majority Black, and the Detroit Board of Education, where most of our kids have gone to school, or certainly went to school during the 70s and 80s and 90s. Those governmental entities were majority Black and run by Black folk. Yet, Black people are still marginalized in this community and other communities in the year 2020. And so that's necessitated, as I sort of bring it home to, what does all that mean? What Bob has talked about so eloquently, and what Jamon has talked about so eloquently in scholarly fashion? What does all of that mean today? Well, it means, of course, as I pointed out, we've had an African-American mayor in Detroit. We've had an African-American president and Barack Obama. But still, there is work to be done by all of us. All who want America to be a place where everybody truly has an opportunity to succeed. You wonder sometimes, are we getting closer? As we see the protests that have been carried out over the last 40 days in Detroit and other places, you wonder sometimes, how far have we come, and how far do we have to go? Well, what I do at MichiganAdvance.com, and we are a Lansing-based policy and politics news site, MichiganAdvance.com. I report on the policy that comes through Lansing in locations like Detroit on a daily basis. We still have to continue to fight as people of color, and most certainly African Americans. So much so that last year, a sister, an African American woman from Lansing, Sarah Anthony, felt the need, felt the responsibility, felt it important to introduce policy that would allow for people who look like me not to be discriminated against in the workplace because they might wear braids or twists or locks. Imagine in 2020, a bill being necessary to say, to protect African Americans, women or men, who want to wear dreads or locks or twists, a bill being necessary to protect them in the workplace from being harassed, discriminated against, or ultimately fired. Well, in Lansing, that bill is sitting on a desk. It has not been taken up. Some areas of the country, by the way, have been more progressive. California has signed, Governor Newsom in California has signed the bill that was entered there, and it's now an act that points out that men and women cannot be discriminated against from wearing braids, locks, and twists. But we still have that challenge here in Michigan. And Sarah Anthony, Representative Anthony, felt a need to introduce that legislation, and that was last year. That wasn't 1925 or 1836 or 1736. And so we have work to do. Many of the men and women who are protesting in Detroit and other cities, particularly in Detroit, one of the things that they're concerned about is the use of facial recognition and police matters and law enforcement matters. There is an argument to be made that people of color are disproportionately and falsely accused of crimes at a higher rate than whites because of the use of facial recognition. That is policy that is before the Detroit City Council right now. And so again, this is not the 1942 or 1825. This is 2020. Facial recognition is an issue for many people who are protesting and calling for defunding the police. Last year, or actually I think it was earlier this year, a noose was found at a school in Grosse Pointe. Imagine that. It's 2020. It is not so out of the realm of possibility for people like Brother Bob and Brother Jamon to reconcile, because they know that the Grosse Pointes, the enclave just east of Detroit, the exclusive, economically exclusive enclave, the Pointes did not have a black homeowner. The Pointes did not have a black homeowner to 1965. Imagine that. Now, there were lots of black folks, Brother Bob and Brother Jamon, y'all know, that were in Grosse Pointe before 1965, but they were domestic workers. They were what you call domestic workers, largely women who were going from Detroit to these homes to take care of white families, to help nurture white babies, but they weren't homeowners. And so we haven't had, in this region, it took 1965 to have a black homeowner in the Pointes. And even today, none of the 5 points have a majority black population. Grosse Pointe Park is probably the most diverse. Its population, the census, we're doing a census right now. Many people will believe that the black population in Grosse Pointe Park may end up being 15, maybe 20% on the high end after the 2020 census. We don't know that yet, but those communities still don't have a majority black population. And when we talk about policy, systemic racism being carried out against black folks and people of color, housing discrimination, as I talked about in 1925 with Ossie and Sweet, is still alive today. The Pointes didn't even have a African-American council member until 2 years ago. Imagine this, Brother Jamon, a sister whose first name is Sierra Leone. Sierra Leone Donovan becomes the first African-American council member in any of the Pointes, and that was just 2 years ago. She was appointed and then unfortunately lost the runoff election to hold the seat. There's still work to do. And finally, as I close, we have to talk about healthcare disparities and environmental racism, and how that is very much part of systemic racism. All you have to do is get on I-75. I'm 10 minutes away, a 10-minute freeway drive from Southwest Detroit. And when I'm on I-75 on a day like today, if I roll down my windows and go past the refinery, the oil refinery down in Southwest Detroit, the air smells different. Healthcare officials will tell you that the rates of asthma in Southwest Detroit, particularly a black and brown majority community, are higher than any other place in the state. That's environmental racism. That's codified public policy. Healthcare disparities are codified codified policy that results in systemic racism. One has to wonder, why do we have, as African Americans, higher cases of diabetes? It's not just because we like to eat pork. Some of us do. I like to eat my bacon every once in a while. But there are healthcare disparities in terms of codified policy that make the opportunity for me to have access to healthcare more challenging than people who are white and live in more affluent communities. I'm trying to bring home, as I close, the legacy of what Brother Bob and Brother Jamon talked about when we try to figure out how has systemic racism affected Black folks and other people of color historically, and how it continues to affect us now. Mm-hmm. And with a minute left, I can't close without talking about COVID-19. we all know that COVID-19 has disproportionately affected people of color, particularly African Americans. This is systemic racism codified in public policy. And my good friend Jamon lost his mother earlier this year to that deadly virus. And one of the things that we have to grapple with and continue to fight against, and I'm so proud that New Detroit, 52 years into the game, is continuing to evolve itself and continuing to fight these fights, is because history is important. I'm the first person that will tell you that history lives and we should know it. And Bob believes that too. And certainly Jamon does. But we have to continually find ways to take that history, share that history with audiences that may not know it, and connect it with what's going on in 2020. And so again, I'm so glad that New Detroit has offered this opportunity for us to have this dialogue and this continued conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, thank you. And I'm so glad to have all of you to join us today, to give us this context, to give us this rich history and to connect it in so many ways, how it's tied to our education, our ideas about our society, our policies. You know, you laid that framework out. And I just want to share with everyone who's joining us that our format was a little bit different because, and I know that a lot of town halls, there's a lot of back and forth and dialogue, and we're going to just close out with a little bit of dialogue among ourselves. But the one thing that we wanted to do is for people to be able to fully hear one another. And as you can see, all three of the guests had a wealth of information to share, and we wanted people to fully take in, fully absorb. And I know that long after you are listening to this, that we hopefully it's food for thought for further dialogue and discussions to happen. And as I said, y'all brought so many different points that we could easily spend another hour or two on, but I wanted to just have a conversation among ourselves. We have this worldwide shift, and it's an opportunity for us to learn about our history. It's an opportunity for us to think about narrative shifting. It's an opportunity for us to think about going forward, how do we make impact in our society, in our communities, and so I want each of you to kind of close out by giving your final thoughts on the historical relevance of history in this global movement, and what should we be focusing on now? Just maybe one thing that we should be focusing on now as a collective people. And I'm going to start with you, Bob.
Well, I kind of want to speak directly to the young people who've been leading the struggle out in the street, and it's been heartwarming to see them out there risking their lives.
Fantastic.
One of the things I would like to tell them that, I was involved in the 1970s. Matter of fact, Kenneth Cockrell was my attorney because I was arrested and charged with inciting to riot up at Eastern Michigan University. And so I spent about 2 or 3 years under indictment before it was finally resolved in my favor, thanks to Ken, of course. But I finished college and went on with my life. But one of the things that happened when we were involved in the struggle on college campuses is that after the set-ins and taking over the buildings and, all of the out in the street kind of thing, we spent about 2 or 3 years meeting with the administration, strategizing, and most of the demands that we requested and wanted were ultimately granted. As a matter of fact, looking back on those times, many of the things that we were asking for, universities now do just to survive, like tutorial programs, recruiting Black students, having Black studies. At that time, people considered those radical ideas, but now they're accepted. And so I want to say to young people that what you're fighting for will 10, 15, 20 years from now, in terms of policing and community control and dealing with the public differently in terms of police matters, those things are going to happen. I truly believe that. And so, but you have to, at some point, leave the street and begin to deal with the policies and the politicians and the laws that will make that happen. It won't happen. Streets may start it, it may ignite it, but it's a long struggle and you have to be prepared for the long haul.
For the long game. I appreciate that, because right now it is a moment, but in order to be involved with this movement, knowing that it's long term. Jamon, I wanted to hand it off to you. What is it that we should be focusing on right now during these times?
Yeah, I want to piggyback off of what Bob said, because same thing. He was at Eastern, I was at Western, but a couple of decades later, I was at Western, and same thing. We protested, and in my case, I didn't have any charges that would have ended me up in jail, but I was, of course, going to be kicked out of the school. In the Kalamazoo branch of the NAACP hired our attorney, and we, of course, won. We didn't get kicked out of school, but we also began negotiating with the university. So I understand where the youth are, and organizing and protesting, and the resistance to this and the backlash to your righteous demands for equality and justice. One of the things I want people to focus on, which doesn't get talked about probably as much as it ought to, is housing discrimination. The history of housing discrimination is attached to much of all of the other things that activists are fighting for. But we talk about them like they're separate. So we talk about school inequality, like Detroit versus Grosse Pointe schools, like that's a thing. And we don't attach it to housing discrimination. The reason why the schools are unequal is directly attached to housing discrimination, which was not just city Grosse Pointe policy, it was that, not just at one point Detroit's policy, it was that at one point, but federal policy. Housing discrimination was a federal policy. So it's important to attach that. The reason why we have environmental racism, where certain neighborhoods have more factories, have more pollution, and other neighborhoods don't. The reason why that is directly attached to housing discrimination. The reason why there's more liquor stores in certain neighborhoods versus other neighborhoods is directly tied to housing discrimination. And the reason why there's a wealth gap between African Americans and whites is largely, not totally, but largely due to housing discrimination. Right now, we're dealing with people losing their homes, illegal foreclosures in the state of Michigan. That's from that legacy of housing discrimination. People's property taxes are too high. People pay more for insurance. There's auto insurance redlining and home insurance redlining. That's all aspects of housing discrimination. And how the police operate in certain communities versus other communities is tied also to housing discrimination. Housing discrimination is really at the base of a lot of other issues that we fight about, but we fight about them separately. And I want I want activists to understand this history of housing discrimination so that they can, when they're fighting, that becomes a part of the world of issues that they're making demands about.
Thank you for that. Thank you. And Ken, I know you're big on policy, policy and housing. That may not be what you want the world to focus on, but I love the fact that you're focused on policy. What is it that you want to share?
Well, I mean, like Bob and like Jamon, I entered Morris Brown College in Atlanta in August of 1988. And during our student orientation, we're 18 and 19-year-olds, and we had an orientation, one of the orientations, several orientations given by the late Reverend Joseph Lowry, who died over the last year. Dr. Lowry was a legend in the South and certainly in Atlanta. And Lowry talked to these young African American kids from all over the country about the importance of voting. And we were young. Many of us hadn't cast a vote yet, and we sort of poo-pooed the idea of being involved in the participatory process from a voting perspective. Later that school year, about 24 of us took over an administration building. We were holed up in the administration building. We snuck in at night, took the building over so the president and others couldn't get in the morning. And we were fighting for two things: more Black studies on campus and tuition that was more affordable. Not very different from a lot of other schools. Later that month, Wayne State did it. Later that month, Michigan State did it. 25 years before that, Howard University did it. But we thought that we had all the answers as 18 and 19-year-olds that in April of 1989. And Jamon, I know you'll appreciate this, and Brother Bob, I'm sure you will too. We had some connections, some family connections with some of the protesters. We had a chance to talk to Brother Hakeem Matabuti from Chicago, started Third World Press. Talked to H. Rat Brown, who was living in Atlanta at the time, and Dr. Khalid Abdul Muhammad, who was, I think at the time, the second man under Louis Farrakhan in the Nation of Islam. We talked to all those heavy brothers, and they said a couple things to us. They said, number one, we appreciate what you're doing. Number two, y'all ain't the first folk who've done this. And number three, what's required of you is to carry out what you want, but go back to your communities and work within the process. Now, some of them had different ideas of what the process meant. Some of them were talking about physically voting at the ballot box. Some of them were talking about carrying out tutorial programs for younger people, but they were talking about participating. And my wife and I were joking. My wife was joking me last night as we were watching the protesters last night via television in Northwest Detroit. And yeah, I've become not ideologically conservative in the Democrat and Republican sense, but as I'm 52 now, and I have a somewhat different strategy about affecting change than I did when I was 22. And my wife was joking me, and she said, well, you're the old man on the line. You're the man who says, get off my line, get off my line. But what I've argued with the young people, and all of them aren't young, but the people who are protesting in cities like Detroit, is we got an election coming up in August and in November. And that might not be the end all and be all, but you can make the change if you want to defund the police. If you want to find other resources for law enforcement rather than local police departments, the best way to start doing that is to vote next month and the vote in November. And so as I close it out, I believe that is certainly one of the ways forward. It may not be the only one, but it is the one in which we can see some immediate change, at least in terms of the men and women who are going to create policy moving forward.
Thank you for that. Thank you so much. Well, I want to thank all of you for joining us and thank everyone for listening in. And I hope you will join us next time for our content and conversations series as we continue the dialogue. I just wanted to say that I found out something today that all four of us have in common is that we all participated in protests during our college years. So I won't go into mine, but I do want to encourage folks to keep fighting for justice, to keep pushing the envelope and not settling for the status quo. We are all in this together, and change only happens when we all are putting in and forth that effort. So my final thing is for everyone is I hope that your families stay safe and be well and continue to support each other during these unprecedented times. Thank you all, and we will see you next time. Have a great evening.